We often would like to put in narrow borders or narrow strips, but we find that difficult. We're afraid that our piecing won't be precise enough and it will look a little bit off. So I want to show you two ways to put in 1/4-inch strips into your quilts. Now you might want to do this within the midst of a quilt, between pieces, between various patches within your blocks, or you might want to actually do this as a narrow border on your quilt. So I'm going to show you two different techniques. Sometimes one or the other will be the way to go, and lots of times it'll simply be your choice which one you would prefer to do. The first one I'm going to show you is a foundation piecing technique. Now if you're one of those folks who say, no, I won't foundation piece, just stay tuned. I'll get to a method that you'll like better. But for those of us who enjoy foundation piecing, I think this method's really great. I first discovered this by reading a book called Garden Stars, and it's by Liz Schwartz and Stephen Seifert. And they really, to the max, use these strips. And here's an example of one of the pieces that you can produce using their method. So you can see in this particular method that they've come up with, they put a 1/4-inch strip, in this case black, but you could use any color, 1/4-inch strip between every single patch in the block. It gives a stained glass appearance, but it's a little different than the traditional stained glass techniques. When you use a traditional stained glass technique, you're sewing bias strips on top, and that has a different look. Both are great methods, but this is a way that you can actually piece it right into the quilt. Now I'm going to show you how we can do this. We're going to just make a very simple foundation pieced block. And so I'm going to take my narrow strip. Now I've cut my strip at 1 inch wide. If you want to get to a 1/4 inch with foundation piecing, a strip cut at 1 inch gives you plenty of flexibility, makes it easy to put in. And with foundation piecing, you know, you just put a couple of pins in place to keep your piece of your patch in place as you work. You don't want it to slip on you. And you just put it through the paper. And now you're ready to turn it over and to stitch. Now with foundation piecing, if you haven't done this before, it's a method where you stitch right on the paper. What I like about foundation piecing is the precision of it, because if you can stay on the line, and that might be a big if for some of us on occasion, but if you stay on the line, it's quite an easy method to do. It allows you to sew a very straight line. So we're simply going to stitch on the line. Now, once you have it stitched, remove your pins. And we do the trimming of our seams with foundation piecing. We trim our seams after we've stitched. It's a little bit different than going the other way. So you simply fold your paper back. If you foundation piece, this is just basic foundation piecing. If you haven't done it before, though, this will give you an idea. And you want to simply trim your seam down to 1/4 inch. And now you're ready to press your narrow strip out. I'm going to press it out in a way. Press it out towards the other strip. And now you're ready to add your second patch. And when you add this second patch, you'll be ready to have your narrow seam. Now you just kind of want to check, be sure it's going to cover. Looks good, looks like it's going to work just about right for us. You're going to just pin it just loosely so that when you go to sew, it stays in place. And you're going to go back and you're going to stitch. Now one thing I want you to notice as I'm stitching is, notice that my line, I've simply drawn my line 1/4 inch away from the other line. You could do this if you wanted it to be 3/8 inch. You could draw it 3/8 inch away. You could draw it 1/2 inch away. So this method doesn't work just for 1/4 inch. This method also could work for any other fairly narrow strips that you would like to put into your blocks. And now you can see that we have a narrow strip that we've sewn in there. and we take our pins out. We again need to trim up our seam. I'm going to trim our seam right here. You just trim it up to about 1/4 of an inch. One of the nice things about foundation piecing is you don't have to be real precise when you cut out your patches, and I kind of like that. You can cut them a little bigger. You're going to press your yellow piece away from your strip, and now you can see that we have set in a 1/4 inch strip. Quite straight, quite nice, works very well. So that's our first method. Very, very easy. I'll show you a couple of pieces that you can do with this. Here's a piece that this really takes this concept, I'd say, to the extreme of putting in many, many narrow strips. And it gives a bit of a stained glass look. And it sort of gives each patch of your quilt a little bit of distinction because it's set off by your 1/4 inches. So if you thought this wasn't possible, it's very, very easy. It's what I just showed you. It's simply being able to stitch on a few lines. And you can draw your lines, as I said, any width that you would like to draw them. Now I'm going to show you a second method because some of you don't like to foundation piece, and the other reality is that there are going to be places within your quilts where foundation piecing is not possible. So this method is going to show you that. And I'll show you an example of when I say it's not possible. This particular block, I wanted to have the narrow 1/4 inch border all the way around the center of the block. Now that couldn't be foundation pieced, so I had to come up with another way to try to get an even 1/4 inch all the way around. And I'm going to show you the method that I used to do this. As you notice, I don't have a paper backing. I simply have my pieces, and I'm simply going to put my strip onto my red. Looks pretty much like what I did, but as you notice, I'm not working with any foundation underneath. So this will be a matter of my being able to stitch a nice 1/4 inch seam as I hook these together. But it's just like sewing patches together. It's what you're used to doing on your quilts. You want to just use your 1/4 inch foot here. You want to line it up along the edge of that. Quilters, we're pretty familiar with that 1/4 inch seam, and that's all we're doing here is our standard 1/4 inch seam. Keeping our edges even as we go. Now let me say that this black strip, if it looks a little bit narrower than I was working with, in this case it is important that you need to cut your strip to be the size you want the finished patch plus a 1/2 inch. So this strip, rather than being an inch wide, this strip is 3/4 inches wide. That gives me ability to do a 1/4 inch seam on each side of the strip. I'm going to press that down. I'm going to go ahead and press it out. Now, I just now pressed it because I'm used to thinking this way. I actually pressed it the wrong way. So I'm going to show you what I should have done. You'll see that I pressed it towards the strip, and that's the normal thing. As a quilter, that's what we normally do. In this case, though, you want to not press it that way. You want to press it the other way. So we actually want to press it towards our red strip. So we're going to do that over. See, we get these habits and we forget what we're doing, don't we? We forget that there's a different way we want to do it sometimes. And the reason we want to press it this way is that when I turn this over, I'm going to be able to see my seam that I just sewed. So you can see, I can see my seam. If I had pressed it the other way, I wouldn't be able to see that when I add my next patch. So now I'm ready to add my yellow patch on, and I'm going to place it on. And I'm going to just stitch it in the seam. But I'm going to want to be sure to put my pins on the side, on the black side, because that's where I can see my seam from my first round of stitching. And you're going to see that that's going to make a difference. That's how I'm going to be able to be sure I do it. Now, I could just stitch a normal 1/4 inch seam, but then it's likely that I might not get a perfect, nice 1/4 inch strip. So instead of lining up with the right side of my foot like I'm used to doing, I'm going to actually line up the left edge of my pressure foot with that seam that I just sewed. And I'm going to keep the left edge of my pressure foot on that seam as I sew. And as I do that, what you will see is that I will end up with an even distance away from that first seam, which means that the strip we'll have in the end will be an even 1/4 inch away. And you can see as I'm stitching that I am keeping that left edge right along that seam line, the first seam line that I stripped. So as you can see, we have a nice even seam there. You can see that there's a strip there. Now when you press this, you can press it either way, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to press the yellow out. And when you press the yellow out, you'll see that now what you have between your red and yellow patches is a very nice even seam. And it's a nice narrow seam, and it's come out very much like our other one looked. So you can this way get a narrow seam when you can't do it on a foundation. This is especially a good way to do it if you want to add a narrow seam in your border. And here's a quilt that shows how that's been done. You can see that there is a narrow border all the way around. If you think about framing a picture, oftentimes these days we get a double mat, and that inside mat is just a little narrow strip of color. That's kind of a nice concept to also put into our quilts. And by using this technique, you'll be able to produce that nice, even, narrow border. Now, I like these little narrow borders. I put them into quite a few of the things I did. So when I was asked to design a quilt using a Dr. Seuss print for a special issue for kids' quilts that we were producing for Quilters newsletter, I decided I wanted some little narrow strips in there. And I couldn't decide which way to go, but in the end I did the second method that I've shown you. And that quilt has fussy cut Dr. Seuss, actually Cat in the Hat, fussy cut Cat in the Hat faces, and between each one is a little narrow strip, so it kind of lets each cat in the hat stand out with that little tiny 1/4 inch strip. So don't be afraid now of narrow borders. You can do them, and you can pick either of these methods or a combination of both as fits the quilt you're making.